story that, as Jake mentioned, touches on very old Tibetan manuscripts, but also ethnographic research that I'm doing today. It's not going to be one of those lectures which is where everything's neatly packaged and completed, because this is a kind of research report in progress in many ways. I'm just first going to run through the point of my lecture and what I think we can get out of the materials I'm going to investigate. So we should always ask this question when we do research: what's the point of doing this? What can it tell us about the people we're interested in the period? So I'm going to look at two very old manuscripts, and I'll talk about their dating later. For me, the most important thing they can deliver in terms of results is that they give an insight into cosmology and the way people thought of themselves as humans about 1,000 years ago in the region of Tibet and the Himalayas. And it's a non-Buddhist or apparently uninfluenced by Buddhist view of the world. And in my field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, the age of this kind of information is remarkable. We really know very little outside of Buddhist texts about how people thought about themselves and their place in the universe. The second value in the study of these manuscripts is that they, because of their age, they were produced at a time when Tibetans were evolving their language very rapidly from an old Tibetan language into the classical Tibetan language, and this process was influenced by dialects all over the plateau as well. And also ritual culture was evolving rapidly with the consolidation of Buddhist schools in this period about 1,000 years ago. So that's the second thing I want to try and talk about tonight, or touch on. The third thing is one of the manuscripts has paintings inside of it. I think about 50-something paintings survive in the leftover folios that we still have. And because these folios have been dated with an AMS scientific dating method, they rank among the oldest paintings on cloth and paper that we actually have dated from the Tibetan sphere of cultural influence. So they're quite valuable for art historical studies. Finally, I'll touch on this only at the end. This is a rather non-Buddhist lecture for what is usually a Buddhist forum. How the content of some of these old ritual texts that I will look at has been appropriated by Buddhist authors of the revealed treasure tradition, or terma in Tibetan. And last but not least, the objects themselves and their age, they rank among the very first and the oldest material of this kind, secular or mundane ritual texts, non-Buddhist texts, that have ever been found on the Tibetan Plateau or in the Himalayas, because all of the older material was found along the southern Silk Road so far. So that's a very significant point about the material I'm going to talk about. The first manuscript I want to look at, and I will look at these manuscripts as both physical objects and look at their content as well. It doesn't have a title, its first folios are missing, but we know from its contents that it describes a ritual called Nildri Dulwa, and it's contained in a corpus of old manuscripts which were found in a Buddhist stupa, shrine, called Gatang in Tibetan. Now, when we look at this kind of material, in other words, very old ritual texts written for non-Buddhist purposes, addressing mundane goals of the here and now world, most of the oldest material does not come from Tibet, as I say. It comes from the southern Silk Road, where Tibetans had their imperial colonies for a while, mainly in the Lop Nor region, Especially from this area, we have wooden slip documents that mention rituals and ritual specialists. And then we have in Dunhuang, of course, the large corpus of old Tibetan documents that were discovered. But the material I'm going to talk about is very, very far away from that. It's down here in the very southernmost part of central Tibet, in an area called Tamshul, which was an old kind of principality in the time of the empire. And you see it's very close to Bhutan. Now for the last 10 years I have been working as an ethnographer in exactly this area just south of the manuscript's discovery. And the story of how I came across these manuscripts is interesting. They were discovered by other people and turned up well, one of them turned up in China and one of them turned up in the West. And a friend, I was at a dinner in a hotel in Lhasa in 2010, and a Tibetan friend of mine from the academy had just drunk half a bottle of baijiu with me. We said good night, and it was a great evening, and he put an envelope in my hand and he said, because of what you've told me you've been doing in Bhutan, I think you should read this book. And it was a publication with facsimiles of these Gatang manuscripts, which I went home, much to the disgust of my wife, and stayed up all night reading in bed. And I recognised the rituals I had been studying for the last 10 years in these texts. So that's why I got onto this subject in the first place. Because habitually I'm not looking at 1,000-year-old manuscripts. That's not part of my usual tradecraft. So if we zoom in on this area, you'll see the Gatang manuscripts come from this shrine called Gatang Bombache in Tibetan, the great shrine of Gatang. And this is connected by a river valley, a major river valley that transects the Himalayas. In other words, it flows straight through the mountains and goes into the Himalayas in Bhutan. There's also another river valley to the east, the Nyamjangchu, which connects the same general area directly with the Himalayas. In other words, it's a highly accessible frontier here. You don't have to cross high mountain paths to move back and forth. So this kind of information will be useful later on in my talk. Now, a very famous British diplomat who lived in Lhasa and Khyentse in Tibet in the middle of the 20th century, before the Chinese occupation, Hugh Richardson, took this photo in the 1940s of the Gatang Bombache stupa, and it was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, or very badly damaged, and some local Tibetans took it upon themselves to restore it in 2005 and 2006. And this is a photo before the restoration. When they were restoring it, they were picking up all the rubble and sorting it all out and thinking what to rebuild. And inside the structure, one of them came across a packet of 4 old texts, as well as some other what appear to be later texts. But the very old ones are the ones I'm going to talk about, and they're known as the Gatang manuscripts among Tibetan scholars. So this was just a lucky find. Unfortunately, we don't know where in the stupa these things were housed, and all the things that archaeologists would want to know, so we're missing some information. These documents were published. Other people have worked on them besides myself. I've only worked on one text from Gatang and made reference to a few others. But I have not been happy with the results that others have generated so far. And I'm not criticising them, they did pioneering work, but these texts are notoriously difficult for reasons I'm just about to show you. They're very difficult to read. This is what these Gatang Bombache manuscripts look like, and this is not for a picture of the manuscript that I'm talking about tonight, but it looks almost identical to this. This is a manuscript called the Nakra, which means stories about yaks, actually. And you see, especially where the arrow is, I'm trying to indicate that this is not a loose folio text. This is a bound booklet with round cut corners. and it has a size something like that. You know, it's a working manual of a ritual specialist, something you hold in your hand while you're doing a rite and flip the pages off. So all the Gatang manuscripts are booklets, and all the manuscripts from this whole region until today have exactly the same morphology, size, and very similar paper to this. So we may be looking at a very old, continuous material culture of manuscripts in this area. As for the orthography on Gatang manuscripts, it's part of a continuum which Sam van Schaik from London has called the Headless Style, which evolved in the Dunhuang manuscripts during the imperial era. And you can see samples of this from 3 different Buddhist texts. And the Gatang sample is the one on the top left there. I'm not an expert on paleography, so I trust in what Sam van Schaik has said here. But when you do look very in close detail at the lettering and compare it to various texts from Dunhuang, there are striking similarities in the orthography. The same hand has not written all the texts in the collection, so it's a variety of different scribes, obviously. Now, we come to an issue which is rather thorny among scholars of this collection of manuscripts. How old are they? And this, of course, counts for a lot. And I've been very disappointed, I can say that frankly here, with dating of historical events, periods and individuals in Tibetan studies for many years. There's a lot of guesswork and a lot of wild claims made about dates. And I'm just putting this up here not to criticise the people who have had an attempt at dating these manuscripts, but what you'll see from all the people who've talked about the texts that I'm going to summarise in a minute is that when you add it all up, there's about 400 or 500 year span of possible dates already out there in the public. So this is a rather difficult problem that has to be solved. I can't solve it, but I'll make some suggestions about what I think is the better end of the scale. And I agree with the last scholar on the list here, Henk Blazer from the Netherlands, who is saying they're no earlier than the 11th century. There's content reasons inside the text that point us in that direction. So much for the physical objects. There are 4 manuscripts in the Gatang collection which are very old and which contain materials that look like they could be pre-11th century in some way or another. The first one is what I've just mentioned, this narratives about yaks, nakrap. And in fact, it has no stories about yaks inside it, I might add. The names of these texts were given by the Tibetan discoverers, I should say, and they don't necessarily reflect the content. So you see it's ritual texts, apotropaic kind of purposes involved here. The second text is the one I will talk about in detail, and this is a very complex exorcistic text. When somebody dies in a very negative manner, I mean, you can die in your sleep, but you can die from all sorts of horrible causes, culturally problematic deaths, I call them. There are possessions of the dead person's soul, and this is an exorcistic technique to liberate the deceased and make sure they go to a good outcome, and also that the possessed deceased soul doesn't trouble the living anymore. It's actually a very common theme in world cultures everywhere. Then there are 2 more texts which I haven't got time to say anything about and which nobody's worked on so far. This one called Narrative of Showing the Way of the Deer to the Deer, and there's a medical text which is probably some scholar of medicine may be reading this, I don't know. I can't say any more about those. So that's where this Nildri Dolwa ritual I'm about to introduce to you sits in the collection. If you look at all the page numbering here, you see this is quite a good corpus. There's quite a lot of material available, and that's very useful for doing comparative philological work. Unfortunately, there's not much else not belonging to this collection that we can compare to it. Most of what I've had to do is work backwards into the old Tibetan documents to find cognates and solve problems. So the first question, and for me when I looked at these texts, is what does Nildri mean? This is an entirely opaque term for somebody who's familiar with classical Tibetan. And I'm only just going to run through the meaning of Nildri and how I found out what I think it means, just to give you an idea of how difficult these texts are to read and what a slow process it is, because there are dozens and dozens of terms in these texts which you end up having to do the same thing I did with Nildri to figure out what is going on. So this is just an example of the methodology, if you like. So one of the well-known by now word transformations in Tibetan over time is the generation of diminutive forms. And some linguists and philologists have theorized that the particle bu, which means child, here, reconstruction, used to be added to a lot of standard words to make the diminutive the child of. So here we have the word for stone. But because of vowel assimilation, instead of dobu we get deo, yeah, and we get a vowel shift and a doubling. And so we get stone, and then pebble is deo and del here. And we find these examples everywhere when we read historically through Tibetan texts from Old Tibetan into Classical Tibetan. Now, most of these diminutive transformations end at this stage with the eu ending. Yeah? But then there's a whole group of them which take a step further and have la and l added at the end. So instead of deu, you get del, and so on. Beu, bel, cow and calf, and so forth. So this was one of the things that seemed to be the meaning of Nell. It looked like the end phase of one of these diminutive transformation series. And my working for this is so. The word na means age or stage of life in Tibetan. And neo is the logically next diminutive form. Yeah? And so it looked like Nell was the end of one of these longer series of diminutive transformations, Nell. Yeah? So we get a young one, which could be applied as such a general term. It could be applied to a baby. In the case of what I'm dealing with, it's also applied to a fetus in the womb and an infant child. So this is what I think Nell means. To confirm this, I looked through the text and found that there are some interesting shifts. You find alternations between a Nildri and a Budri, yeah? Or Nildri Mo and Budri Mo for the female forms, and that pretty much confirmed it to me. It means child or infant of some kind. And we find, in fact, in one old Tibetan text, a form Neo with an S in the beginning, and we also find the variant Neoshun for Nashon, for a young one, young person, youth, and so forth, in an 11th century manuscript, which is well dated. In fact, it's the next manuscript I'll talk about. But then that leaves Dri. And other scholars who've had a crack at this text have come up with all sorts of meanings for the word Dri, mostly derived from either classical Tibetan sources, which were written much later, or from Yungdrung Bon manuscripts from religious texts that also date much later. And I'm not criticizing them, but I mean, these were the attempts, but it didn't seem to work out. inside the Neldri Dulwa text itself, when one reads all the examples of Dri, you find quite obvious patterns start to come out, and you find these properties associated with this word. So it only appears together with a person dying and then turning into a problematic soul, if you want, that wanders around. Dri takes verbs of agency as though it were a living being, and so on. So I was able to be quite sure what Dri means. It applies to a being in a posthumous state, which is a negative being, which wanders around and needs to be controlled. So my working gloss in the end for Neldri, after half a year of banging my head on this, is wandering, bad death, infant spirit, which is of course totally unwieldy, but that's what it means, in context. So I just give you this as an example of dozens of words which are like really hard walnuts, very difficult to crack to get the fruit out of the inside of. And so it's a very slow, laborious task working on these manuscripts. And I guess that's a kind of caution for others too. Don't do it. The second problem with these manuscripts, or methodological and analytical challenge, is that they are quite highly derivative of Old Tibetan language. And if Old Tibetan is a significantly different language from the classical Tibetan that all the Buddhist literature is written in, that we're most familiar with from our educations and our research, and it's different again from forms of modern Tibetan. So you enter a different world where things kind of look familiar in the beginning because you can actually read Old Tibetan, that you can read the individual syllables and words, but you soon run aground trying to make sense of things. So this is a huge challenge with these texts as well, is knowing what's Old Tibetan, what's a later adaptation of it. Just to give a quick example of what you run up against in this Neldri Dulwa text, I did a comparison with one particular Dunhuang manuscript which has ritual narratives which are similar to the Neldri Dulwa narratives. And in fact, most of the framing components of the plots of these stories are lifted from Old Tibetan texts that were found in Dunhuang. And so you can see how close a lot of these correlations are. This is just a small sample from the Neldri Dulwa manuscript. There are many, many more of these. So the correlations are very high, in fact. But there's, minor variations. We're just dealing with proper names here. But then there are technical terms as well, and in a few cases there are grammatical structures that are unusual in a classical Tibetan text. So once one learns to read, almost all over again in some cases, if you're like me who was born and raised on a diet of classical Tibetan and modern Tibetan, then you can start to see what these manuscripts are trying to tell us. So every Neldri ritual is a story, it's a narrative. And the word for that in Tibetan is rub. And rub not only means a narrative, but it also means a series. And there are indeed a series. There's about 20 Neldri tales in this manuscript. And they unfold according to a narrative scheme, which is very standard. They talk about a land where there's a king and a queen, and they have a daughter who gets married to somebody, she gets pregnant, and then the bad things start to happen. And most of the Neldri tales are very tragic, very moving, accounts of pregnant women who die while you come across this regularly, that women die in childbirth, or that they have what's called a septic abortion, which is an infection in the uterus of the fetus, and they're terrible medical conditions, and they usually end up in death in remote communities. This is what this text is about, a real problem of maternal and infant death in the past. So I'm just going to give you a couple of translated extracts to show you the flavour of the text, but also point to the exact nature of the crisis of a Neldri event. The mother's head was facing upwards. The child's head, meaning fetus, head was facing downwards. The pus shot out like a bolting horse. The blood welled up, groaning like an ox. The placenta was twisted in the covering. The blood spread out, sarara. Defilement of the La, the ancestral deities in this case, melted the glaciers. Defilement of the lakes penetrated to their depths. Up above, the Hla were unworshipped. Down below, the Dri were unsuppressed. And what is the crisis here? Well, obviously, a mother and child had died, and it says earlier in this same passage that they did die. It explicitly says who died, and this was the reason. It looks like a septic abortion, if you want to put it in contemporary medical terms. Here's another passage, and it will make clear the actual crisis that is here, besides the fate of the individual baby and mother. Up above, the La were impure. Down below, the Dri was unsuppressed. The name and designation given to the infant Dri was Trakshama. The La were driven into the sky. The wild geese vanished into the lake. Human beings were not begotten by the La. So the actual problem is that the human community are cut off from Hla. And here in this text, Hla means a sky ancestor, The ancestral deities in the sky. We know this is an old idea because it was part of the mythology of the foundation of the Tibetan Empire in the 7th and 8th century. The very first political myths in Tibet talked about the kings coming down from the Hla in the sky to rule on earth. So this idea is an old Tibetan idea, no problem there. So the problem is the La are impure, we cannot worship them, we're cut off from them, but the big result comes in the last line. They cannot produce us human beings. So here we have, explicitly we're being told that people come from the sky ancestors, which is the old imperial narrative of the first Tibetan dynasty. But I think this is now, of course, set in an everyday life context of terrible medical crisis. Then the text goes on to offer ritual solution. And that's the part that interests me the most, because I'm interested in rituals. Now, of course, these are myths. The narratives are myths, they're stories. But narratives are meant to be precedents of some form, Precedents for taking certain ritual actions. Why should we do a certain set of ritual actions? Well, we do it for this kind of problem, So they're archetypal problems of a sort, which legitimate and establish the validity of doing a particular act, a ritual. So the ritual solution comes next in these texts. All the language is a little bit similar. And by the way, wild geese and water birds they're said to be hlaja in the text. They're the deity's birds, the ancestral deity's birds. So when certain birds appear, it means the ancestors have come down from the sky, flying like birds, of course. So the Hla were driven into the sky. The wild geese vanished into the lake. The Yeshen Karbu, who is the ritual specialist here, attaching a flat bell of gold to a living vulture, opened the portal of the sky again. Upwards, the Hla were purified again. So there's this idea of opening up the sky, purifying a pathway up to the ancestors here. And this is typical of all of these 20 narratives that we have in this collection. These rituals have two stages. The first is done by a Shen priest, the second is done by a Bon priest, who's called a Dribon in this case, related to the word Neldri. He specialises in these kind of possessed, dead people. In the land of Shel Yultur, a girl of Shel, an infant, died. Her Dri was upwards, rambling in the sky. The Driburn was Rajakikyal, converted the Dri from the wild to tame. Its hide was tanned from thick to fine. From the Dri, she was brought down to the Tsun. From the Tsun, she departed to the Hla. I'm leaving the original spelling of these words, Tsun here, because they're very ambivalent in the manuscript. They flip-flop back and forth. From philological analysis of Old Tibetan and Classical Tibetan, we know that this is the original form and this is later folk etymology. These are words from about the 11th century on which explicitly denote paternal ancestors. Yeah? So these words are marking ancestors. But look at the progression. The ritual specialist cleans up the Dri, releases the dead person, tames it, and then the Dri, a female in this case, is brought down, from the top of the sky, I guess, down to the ancestors, but the ancestors aren't on the ground. There's many places in the text that tell us that the Tsun are high up in the air. From there, she goes off to join the Hla, and the Hla are the deities at the top of the sky. The text also makes that cosmological point clear. So there's an interesting kind of schema in this ritual of where this being, this ontological unit, this deceased person who has these different transformations, goes. So I made a plan of the ritual and a kind of diagram to illustrate this. So you have an infant who dies. The text often will say, once the person dies, they're immediately captured by a demon called a sin. And sin, we know from Old Tibetan texts, are demons of the subsoil. They live under the earth and they come up and infiltrate our bodies. And these sin in the text are said to come up and infiltrate the uterus or womb of a pregnant woman and therefore cause premature death of the fetus and the mother. This is made explicit in the text. Once a deceased infant is captured by the sin, it becomes a Dri and starts wandering around and making trouble. So the Shen ritual that I quickly gave you a textual little vignette of works like this. The Shen will perform a very long series of purificatory rites with lustrations and incense smoke and many other stages, too detailed to go in here, but crosses 9 thresholds, and they're talked about as door sills or door steps and doors upwards into the sky to the top of the sky. And when they reach there, the second specialist, the Dribon, takes over and conducts the now purified dead person, or soul if you like, of the dead person, to the ancestors who are also up there, and then to the La, who live at the top of the sky anyway. They also are said to go to the men, and men are the female version of these patrilineal ancestors, Hla and men. So we'll just leave it there now, because I'm going to invoke this ritual scheme at the end of the talk and connect it with what's in the second manuscript. I hope it's not too confusing and complicated. Now an interesting thing that I mentioned at the start of my talk is the area where this text was physically found. We don't know how old it is. I'm guessing it's from the 11th or early 12th century myself. In Gatang Bompoche is immediately adjacent to where I've worked for the last 10 years recording rituals of a particular cult of revitalization rites. And in this cult, there's a ritual specialist, often called a Bon, sometimes called a Shen, who calls down patrilineal ancestors from the sky, who are Hla, and makes women pregnant. The La make women pregnant, they give fertility to men, women, and their animals, and that's basically it. The specialist called Bon and Shen, I call them shamans because if one reads the comparative ethnography of the Himalayas and look what other anthropologists are saying a shaman is, this fits the scheme very, very closely. So there's no doubt that these people practice in the comparative ethnographic sense as shamans. They have the characteristics. So the sites of this cult that I've documented, there's about 70 odd of them, are these diamonds here. And what I found is that all these shamans called Bon and Shen have manuscripts. Yeah? They have Tibetan manuscripts. They have little booklets that look just exactly the same as the Neldri Dulwa text from Gatang Rinpoche. But I haven't been able to date any of them using radiocarbon dating or anything yet. That's coming up in the future. But the morphology is identical. The orthography of and the nature of the text is a little bit different. But what I did find is that in all these sites marked red, including the Gatang Rinpoche, we find philologically provable strong connections between these Neldri Dulwa texts and what these shamans in northeast Bhutan are doing today. Yeah? So they have texts which are directly descendant from these old manuscripts from Tibet, and they're still practicing exactly the same rituals described in the Gatang Rinpoche text today, with some modifications, as one would expect. So I'll leave that manuscript behind now and move to the second manuscript. And this is an untitled collection of loose folios. About 50% of them are now missing, unfortunately. We don't know where the text came from. I call it the Mokotov manuscript because it's owned by a man by the name of Mokotov who lives in New York and gave me permission to use it. The photographs of the manuscript that I've been using for my work come from Vienna, courtesy of Professor Deborah Klimberg-Salter, who's an art historian. And I first saw this text on display in an ethnographic museum in Vienna after Mokotov had lent it to them, and started reading it. And again, what happened in Lhasa happened to me again in Vienna. I realized I understood this text, and that it had to do with my work in the field. So I've given there's two texts. It's a manuscript page which has got one text written down one side and the other text written down the other side. I'll show you what it looks like. I call these two texts, recto and verso, the Teo and Shalom texts. And that's because of unique terminology that occurs in both of them. So if this is where the Neldri Dulwa text was found, in the Gatang Rinpoche, this is where I hypothesize the Teo and Shalom manuscript comes from. And I'm going to look at the arguments for this provenance towards the end of my talk. So it's a text that comes from this borderland between southernmost Tibet and northeast Bhutan, and the Monyul corridor just to the east here in Arunachal Pradesh. It's part of Indian territory, in fact, here. Now, fortunately, Mr. Mokotov had his text dated with this accelerator mass spectroscopy method, which is better than standard radiocarbon dating because you only need a very small amount of material and it's not so destructive of the objects. So a piece of paper with pigment was analysed, and this is a summary of the results. It gets us into the 11th century, perhaps early 12th at the outside. And I'm not an expert on this, although I can explain that if you need me to. But it's a good date for the paper and the pigment, yeah. And it's a very strong date in terms of almost all the other texts from this era that people are identifying as dated from this area. They have no physical evidence to back up their claims. So this is an important document and an important test, because it's a benchmark that's much more certain than almost all the others we have. This is how the manuscript looks like. This is the most intact series of frames in the whole text. There are usually 4 frames in the long strip, and you'll see the verso and the recto sides there. So the right-hand bit is on the back side of the left-hand panel, and you can see the dimensions there. You know, so it's 17 inches and I don't know, about 4 or 5 inches wide. You'll also notice which is typical of Gatang and Bumpache manuscripts also, that they have the circles here and a kind of abstract hole, which goes back to the old palm leaf poti tradition from India. But this became a convention in Tibet. Yeah, you didn't actually have a hole; you just drew the circle. Where it's one of those things that hung around and was totally redundant. So you can see that this is a highly illustrated manuscript. We have a series of small paintings with a caption underneath them. It's not easy sometimes to articulate the text with the image always, but most of the time they seem to fit together quite nicely. So I understand this as another ritual manual that's illustrated as a handbook for somebody to hold in their hand while doing a ritual and just leaf through the folios. You can still see these kind of manuscripts used in northeast Bhutan today. I call them Concertina Manuscripts because these strips are actually folded. You can see the fold lines here, and this one of course is broken. They're folded up like a concertina, and they're flipped over like this by ritual specialists. So it's, in a way, it's like the Gatang manuscripts. The morphology is the same as the manuscripts we find the shamans with today. This manuscript also has its analogues today in the hands of these same shamans. So we have to divide this text into frames to be able to talk about it. And the sixth surviving folio is the nicest one to illustrate because all four are present. And this is what the whole array of the manuscript looks like for the Teo text. So you can see how much is missing. The blank squares are what we don't have anymore. There's some interesting features about this. How do we know that there were 13 frames? The 11th series is completely gone. We don't have any of that left that we know of. Perhaps we do because two of the folios we can't really confidently assign to these positions. This assignment was done by somebody else, actually for the Vienna exhibition where I first saw the manuscript, and I'm still following that mostly. Well, the third series of frames are numbered, fortunately, yeah, and they go from 1 to 13. Well, of course, we don't have 1, 2, and 3, and then some of the inscriptions at the end talk about the 13 Teo as a unit, yeah, so we're pretty confident there were 13 of these. 13, of course, is such an important cosmological number for Himalayan and Tibetan people, especially in old Tibetan texts. It's the number of levels from the earth up to the sky, where the ancestors live. And so this is the flip side of the same folios, and you can see the number of surviving folios I've calculated there. So the two red outlined here are what I'm going to do a quick analysis of so we can see how the ritual sequence goes. Because I think these folios had to be read from top to bottom, and then first from top to bottom 1, top to bottom 2, top to bottom 3, and all the way through, and then the text was flipped over and the same sequence was undergone with the other side. So these are two different rituals on the same paper, back and front, but they're highly complementary. They just dovetail right into each other when you read them and do the analysis. Before I show you an example, again I just want to talk about the language in these texts, because it is very, very difficult in places, and it's already stumped quite a few people. So chances are nobody in the room who didn't see this manuscript before has ever heard of these terms. They're totally unique, Shalom and Jerlong. So where do they come from? Well, we find Lung in Old Tibetan civilian or administrative documents, after which it became redundant and died out. So it probably died out, I don't know, in Tibetan ordinary usage in the 10th century maybe already, after the empire collapsed, and is no more except in this text, which dates from, we know, the 11th to early 12th century. So we're preserving here a very old redundant Tibetan administrative term. It used to mean something like a way station or a postal station or an outpost, where the colonizers of the Southern Silk Road, the Tibetan armies, established these chains of communication to all their far-flung outposts and desert oases and so forth. Every lung was designated by the agents or the inhabitants who were there. So you always had ex-lung of some kind. And this is what we find with the pattern sha lung. So the question is, what is a sha? Now, sha can mean many things in classical Tibetan and in Old Tibetan. So we have some choices here. But it seems from the context of this manuscript, sha is a generic marker meaning wildlife in general. Any wildlife, especially larger animals. I do not think it's a Tibetan word, but I think it belongs to a Tibeto-Burman language from the eastern Himalayas, used in this way. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Jeo, of course, means small birds. It's one of these diminutive constructions which both the Gatang Bompa manuscripts and this text are full of. It's a characteristic they very much share, along with many other things. So my rendering of Shalom is wildlife way station, whatever that means, and I'll tell you what it means in a minute, or small bird way station. And there's a longer form of the same word, which has the word kar, which means a stronghold, or more abstractly, a refuge in it. Now, this text, exactly like the Gatang Bompa manuscripts, is riddled with Old Tibetan borrowings and adaptations. Some of these you see here, There's this craziness about diminutive forms, and they're all very rare, and they're often exclusive to these manuscripts I'm dealing with, and only a very few Old Tibetan ritual texts. We also find stuff reused wholesale, but with totally new meanings. There's this word, it's a name, Jashin Jinmo, refers to a ritual specialist in an Old Tibetan ritual text found in Dunhuang. But in the Shalong and Teo manuscript, it's a type of small forest bird, who we know quite a lot about from the text, in fact. The interesting link here is Lo, which means the south, is part of the story of this ritual specialist involvement, and this is where the bird lives in Loga, which means the far south of Tibet. So we find all these curious links. Somebody's very consciously adapting here material from Old Tibetan into this later text. Now I'll run through this fast, and I'll show you some examples, close up of these folios. But basically it's a ritual sequence. You set up one of these things called a teo, which looks like a kind of tree with some fancy appendages. The ancestral deities are attracted to come when a teo is set up. You invoke protectors for a class of beings who are called small or small deities, small ancestor gods if you like. And the men, they come for the rite. They're being attracted by this teo structure. Then these beings are brought down from the top of the sky through the 13 levels of the cosmos down to earth. And finally, you invoke the ritual precedent, which is like a miniature myth in just a couple of lines, which says somebody died, they were given a proper funeral and some mourning rites, and now, after all that is finished, we're asking for new young ones. So they're calling for new life to be sent by the ancestors, in other words. After that, of course, the new life is supposed to turn up. These young ones who are little gods, basically, literally, in the language of the text. Where do they come? They've come down to the 13 stages of the cosmos, and they're in the world space. And who do they get looked after? They get looked after by the beings of the wilderness all around us. the fortresses in the mountains and in the lakes owned by the deities who are mentioned on in the text. They're looked after in the 13 way stations by the little birds. They're looked after by the wildlife who live in the 13 wildlife way stations scattered throughout the environment. 13 different species of large wild animals. And the wildlife and the small birds, in their turn, are protected by a set of protected deities who also live in nature. So what we have here is the induction of new human life from the top of the sky down to the world from the ancestral beings in the care of Mother Nature, if you want to put it in those kind of popular terms, yeah? And we have a whole web of relationships between different categories of beings who support each other or who have to ward off the problems made by others. I can't go into details here, but it's basically the text expresses this huge amount of interrelationships between all these beings just to ensure the safety of new human lives coming down to the world. This is what these folios look close up, just so you can get an idea of the artwork on them, because I know I'm probably going over time now. They're not as yellow as this. This is just my bad way of transforming images for PowerPoint, sorry. So these, on the right-hand side, you see some of the Jaolung images with different kinds of birds who look after new human lives coming down from the ancestors. And here's another kind of protector of the little gods who come down from the ancestors as they descend through the 13 levels of space. These beings who look like dancing men here, they are the sons of some of the beings of the 13 levels who protect these new lives as they descend through the 13 stations, and there are 13 sets of these beings. These are some of the wild animals in the Shalom, in the wildlife way stations on the right-hand side. And finally, you see a scene on the left of what looks like either a funeral or a mourning ritual, which are explicitly mentioned in the text passages, after which one asks for new life to be sent. Yeah. And he's a protector of the wildlife on the right. Anyway, if you schematized everything I've just told you about, it would look like this. Yeah? The Teo rite is something that starts at the top of the sky and comes down to earth, and it results in small hla, small ancestral deities, if you like, literally in the text, who are offspring, and these are the young ones, male and female, who the conductors of the ritual are asking for. When they get down into the world, then the Shalom text kicks in, and it allows this protective sphere where the creatures and environment of the natural world looks after these lives, presumably, and we don't know this, until they are implanted in a woman's uterus to become a male or a female child. So, you know, there's things that are not in this text, and we just have to assume that's the point of the end kind of design of this whole schema. Now, I find these two texts, the Nyaltri Dulwa scheme and the same scheme that I've just talked about here, very remarkable when we combine them together. And I think they come from the same area, and the texts have uncanny similarities in terms of their language, the approximate age we can confidently assign them, the cosmological issues involved, the terminology. But I think they are two sides of the same coin, and I think they need to be compared. I can see people are getting tired and restless, and I understand that. There's been a lot of material. I think, to cut a long story short, I'll speed this up. I've just digested a specific example of both rituals with real names from the text here, just to show what happens. To cut a long story short, New lives are coming down. They have identities which change all the way through until they get from the sky, from the ancestors' realm down to the human realm. The same with the Neldri Dolwa text. You find a deceased person goes through a series of transformations and they end up back in the same place that the new lives have come from in the Teo text. To me, this looks like a perfect example of a complete cosmology of human existence, with this idea of an ancestral realm in the sky. Now, of course, that's just my theory, yeah? But I think there's some good reasons to entertain that theory, especially because the same theory still exists in many places in the Himalayas and is found in the ethnography of many anthropologists who worked in the Himalayas, more or less like this. Similar kinds of rituals are also found throughout the Himalayas, but all of this is not found on the Tibetan Plateau. That's a curious thing. I'm coming to a close now. I want to just talk about some of the provenance indicators that I think exist to place this old painted manuscript, the Teo and Shalong one, in the area, geographical area, in proximity to the Neldri Dolwa and the Gatang Bombache manuscripts, and where I have been doing my ethnography. So here it is again. We have the ethnographic sites of the diamonds. The dotted line is our old illustrated Teo and Shalong manuscript, and the red circle is the Neldri Dolwa. I think they all intersect. The first thing I've already mentioned, and I'm not going to dwell on it for the sake of time, but you see here some examples on the right and in the lower part of Bon Shaman manuscripts from northeastern Bhutan and the Monyul corridor. They're morphologically the same. Of course, the handwriting is now different, yeah, all these centuries later. But the content is the same. That's the clincher here. Yeah. If we look more closely at the orthography and some of the conventions, we find again lots of shared material between the old texts and the new ones. Some of the typical things here are the ergative marker in Tibetan is reduced down to a vowel, I, E, whatever you want, however you want to pronounce it, and sometimes I, S with the true ergative sa particle attached to it. We find ubiquitous use of the particle ra to substitute for rule-bound prefix characters, and also for the superfix characters in these stacked character combinations. Yeah? This is found in both sets of manuscripts, old and new, and in both the old ones. These things are also found in other texts, but they're particularly prominent here, and they're particularly prominent in southern Tibet and this part of the Himalayas over time. Then there's an illegal vertical ligature, which is for a terminal show. And you can see some samples of the modern manuscripts on the bottom and how the same thing was written in the Gatang Bombache texts and in the Neldri Dolwa. I mean, they're not all exactly the same. There's been assimilation of the second suffix here onto that sa, whereas here they're separate. Anyway, the patterns are there and they're quite clear as evidence. Then there's the ethnographic evidence. This is a photograph from one of my research sites, and the object you see here, that it's a structure, should I say, is called a shalom in this local language, and it's decorated with some flowers and other objects. The inside is hollow, and there are the heads and bodies of various wild animals and birds, which are exactly the same names in the local dialect as they are in the old Shalom and Teo text. But they're used differently here. They're sacrifice items. So we have this structure. We have the same kind of ritual specialist who's a bonpo. We have the same purpose for the rites. We have the same la invoked. The main la is called Urigunge, and he's in the old text and he's in this present day cult here. We find the same in birds and animals. We find the same descriptions. In the old text it says the shalom has rinchen dien, which is this decoration, and that's exactly what in the local dialect these people are saying about these decorations on the shalom. So it goes down into great detail. The interesting thing is, the language of these people is a Tibeto-Burman language which is so far unclassified, called Tsangla, and they speak the Dirang dialect of Tsangla. All the Tibeto-Burman languages along the eastern Himalayas have a prefixed generic marker for wild animals, and they all have different ones that code wild animal names, and Sha is the one here, like Sha Lung. The other thing is, having spent 30 years of my life reading ethnographies from one end of the Himalayas to the other and across the Tibetan Plateau and in Bengal and Assam, this is unique. It's the only place that it's found. But tell me if I'm wrong, please, before I make a complete fool of myself. Then we have this kind of stuff. We don't know what the figure on the painting on the right is. We don't know if it's a deity or a ritual specialist, but this is how the ritual specialists who use these shalom look like. Yeah, they have very particular. They're actually called in the local languages the horned headdress or horned hat, and down to details like the plume on the top with a bound bit. It's exactly the same on this horned hat of the present day shalom users. Another interesting thing, as I mentioned, is this wandering bad death infant spirit. This is a cultural pattern which is Eastern Himalayan. It starts in Nepal and goes over into southwest China. And there are rituals for it. But the most interesting data I picked up on this pattern is actually in a book about medicine where this manuscript was mentioned. And this may interest some of the people who work in Nepal here. They probably know about it. But it's the same cultural pattern in as an old form of diagnosis in a Sanskrit text. I don't know about the claimed dates here and so forth, but it's said in the book that where I found this reference that the manuscripts come from Nepal. So they must have been known there. But we find the same thing among the Magar to the west of Kathmandu Valley and the Kami shamans. We find them among the Mewahang Rai in East Nepal, and we find them from there all the way through, right along until the Burmese border through the eastern Himalayas. And the Ido-Mishmi case and the Nishi case, I've actually personally documented the same kinds of rituals, like in Neltri. Then there are the ecological indicators. Now we have wild animals in these shalom whose zoogeographic distribution is limited to the eastern Himalayas very specifically. One of them is the Asian or sand badger, another is the takin, and another is the muntjak or the barking deer. And then in the text we have all this stuff which only occurs, or the musk deer, the alpine musk deer is found wider, but of course it all occurs in the same region I'm trying to point to. Yeah? So we have all of this, all of these correlations. So that was my argument for provenance. It's just a big bag of speculations, I admit, but I think they're pointing us somewhere quite firmly, and it would be nice to get more evidence. My final comment for the night gets us back to Buddhism, just very briefly. And one has to remember that all the people I've talked about who are living today, that I've worked with, are all devout Buddhists. They just have this fertility cult and their ancestors running parallel to their Buddhist practice. I don't know how it was when these old manuscripts were written. It's possibly already the case back then. What's fascinating for me as an ethnographer is that the ancestral cult, which looked like the one found in the old manuscripts, it exists today completely parallel to Buddhism that's been there for 500 or 700 years in the same valleys, and they do not cross streams. Yeah, they run parallel to each other. So we might have every reason to assume that in the old texts, the people who were using them had this cult, and they could have been Buddhists already, but they just did not cross over. Yeah. There's more to say on that. I'll leave it at that. Now, the existence of these old texts, at the time they were available in southernmost Tibet, attracted the attention of a certain kind of Buddhist. These are these terreturn or revealers of hidden treasures who created Theravada texts. These are thought to be revelations from Padmasambhava and other earlier teachers that were hidden and then they get revealed again. But of course, philological analysis shows us they're highly composite in many cases. So other scholars have done this work, not myself, but this is a Yungdrung Bön Tantra, Kawanakpo, the Black Pillar, and a lot of the deity identities are the same ones found in the Gatang manuscripts, including the Nyalri Dulwa. Shenchen Luga, who was an early Bon Turtur, has claimed to have these dates. Nobody's ever given proof of this, independent witnesses. We're back to the dates problem again. He also wrote a collection of tantras. I think 2 or 3 at least are attributed to him in the set, and they're drawn, mythical themes and identities are drawn from the Gatang manuscripts and recycled and changed, of course, in their purpose and deployment. Nyang Nima Izia, who was a very early Teama specialist, who lived in Tamshil, where the Nyalri Dulwa manuscript was discovered and probably written for all we know, and spent nearly all of his life there. He's recycling unique identities of ritual specialists which are found in these old ritual texts into his Dharma history, or Chinjung, which is a very important document. The approximate composition dates of we know quite well. And a fourth example is Guru Churwang, also another southerner from the same area, a native son of the Lodrak area. He went down to the Bhutanese border to a place called Karchu once and had a kind of visionary revelation where he went up to the 13th level of the sky. Instead of the ancestral La, he met Vajrasattva, who handed over, guess what? A bumper, a life vase full of life force. And then he comes back down again, and just afterwards he manages to discover his first Theravada, in this place. So, it's an interesting thing, right? The people who are living here, who are creating Theravada, are overlapping strongly with an old manuscript culture and the narrative themes in it that we already know existed there in the same area. My last observations are these. There's an interesting question that comes out of all of this. The people who composed and used these texts in the beginning, they were very sophisticated adapters of Old Tibetan into an emerging classical Tibetan language, in the milieu of ritual at least. So where did they get this Old Tibetan material from? Because we only know it from about 1,500 kilometers north along the Southern Silk Road. So that begs a big question. I have some theories about it if you're interested sometime. The second point is that many of the people who have looked at these manuscripts or heard about them and then said something about them, they didn't even look at them, they called them immediately Bon or Bön, however you want to pronounce that, or part of the Bön tradition. So this is another thing that scholars just have to change. They cannot just keep calling things Bön unless they have a good reason. And the word Bön itself has to equate to an analytical category that we are rigorous about. Neither of these manuscripts I've described to you and the texts inside them, I think the Nyalri Dulwa has 2 instances of use of the word Bön. Once it names a particular ritual specialist, but there are about 5 other designations for the same kind of ritual specialist in the same manuscript. So it's insignificant. And in the other case, the Teo and Shalom, it's never mentioned. So why should we be calling these things Bön or Bön tradition or whatever everybody else is saying about them? That has to be put on the table for debate. I don't think we can call these manuscripts that unless we have very rigorous criteria for what we mean by that. Thirdly, of course, we're dealing with Tibetan language here. But in the history of the Tibetan language, we know for a fact from the oldest times along the Southern Silk Road until today, people who are not speakers of Tibetic languages, because there is no such thing as Tibetan, there are many Tibetic languages, non-Tibetic speakers who speak other Tibeto-Burman languages are writing in Tibetan script. Yeah? We've known it's always been the case. This seems to be ignored by many people who see a manuscript and just think, oh, it must be the Tibetans who are the authors. I would say here we can't say that about these manuscripts. At the very least, we have to say, because of their content, that they are Eastern Himalayan as well as Tibetan. Yeah? So, finally, we need to do art historical studies of these unique paintings, and that's actually the plan for my next research project. Thank you for your attention.